Good afternoon. My name is Herman Pretorius, and I am the Deputy Head of Policy Research for the Institute of Race Relations. Thank you so much for joining us at this press briefing today. We apologize for not being able to host this briefing as planned yesterday, but I think we all have had some experiences of technological and technical challenges in these times, and hopefully today we can avoid any repeat of that. Just a structure as to how this briefing will work. Firstly, it should be noted that just for the stability of the briefing, any journalists with questions could please WhatsApp them to me personally. I have my phone here in front of me to make sure that I receive them in real time. My number is attached to the press release that was sent out, so please make use of that. The structure is, after I'm done speaking, Dr. Cronje will speak for 15-20 minutes on the content of the briefing, and then we will go to questions. I will give a few minutes immediately after Dr. Cronje had spoken for journalists to send me the questions, and I will handle them and approach them as they come through. Please add the publication you are from and your name in the message, just for me to make sure that I have the right questions from the right people. Right. Thank you very much. Today's briefing will be looking at the political implications, especially for the ANC, of the COVID-19 crisis. Since the start of this crisis, the IRR has really made the point that this is a multifaceted issue, a multifaceted challenge the country faces, and politics, of course, is not exempt from that. Last week, with Dr. Anthea Jeffrey, we did a briefing on lifting the lockdown, the economic consequences, and today Dr. Cronje, the CEO of the Institute of Race Relations, will be taking us through some of his analysis on the political ramifications for the ANC in the main. So without further ado, a last word from me. We published our comprehensive policy response framework titled Friends in Need, How South Africa Can Save Lives and Livelihoods During COVID-19 on the 25th of March. Please refer to that. We have published some further commentary and analysis since, and you are welcome to view those on our website. So there we go. Dr. Cronje, over to you.
Herman, thank you very much. Good afternoon. It is afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody on this call. In the midst of this extraordinary COVID pandemic, we have this week published a book on South Africa's future, titled The Rise or Fall, or is a very important word, The Rise or Fall of South Africa. It's the third in a series of books we've written about the likely long-term future of the country, and published that through our partners at Tafelberg. The book makes an argument about the political future of the country and of the ANC. And it's an argument that became even more appropriate as the implications of the economic lockdown in our country and the global performance of the economy has become more apparent over recent weeks. Over the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk you through that argument and where we believe the ANC ends up as a consequence of the COVID pandemic. If you're familiar with our briefings, what you're going to see now is a bit different. You're not going to see all the charts and the graphics and the data. I'm just going to talk you through the big concepts. But a lot of the data I cite, the charts behind them, it's all available from my colleagues, and you can send Herman an email or a WhatsApp, and he will send that to you. The argument goes something like this. In 2004, an amazing thing happens because we hold an election in the country. It's the decade into democracy. And the ANC is 6 percentage points stronger than it had been in 1994 when Mr. Mandela had led it to freedom. And it struck us as the most amazing thing that the party would be so substantially stronger than at that very great moment of liberation of a decade previously. And we began to try and understand what the reason for that was. And we think we've at over the first 10 people with a job in South Africa had essentially doubled. Yes,
Dr. I do apologize. We lost you at a very, very crucial moment there, just as when you were saying we think we understand why.
Yeah, we think this happens a bit. If my connection fades in or out, my colleagues in Herman let me know, and I'll just repeat the last bit. So, point is this: 2004, there's this election. The ANC does so much better politically than it had done at the moment, the sort of zenith of liberation. And we start to try and understand the reason for that. And the reasons are interesting and often at odds with a lot of what becomes dominant analysis of the ANC in that era. We're able to see, for example, that contrary to the thesis of jobless growth that was thrown at the ANC in its first 15 years, by 2004, the number of people with jobs in South Africa has almost doubled. It's an amazing number. We also begin to see the sharp escalation of the number of people receiving welfare grants in the country. Service delivery indicators strike us as far more successful than the thesis of failed service delivery that becomes a narrative that attaches itself to the latter stages of the Mbeki era. And for example, one we're fond of quoting, but it's not a case of cherry picking, it's representative of the whole, is in that first decade, roughly 10 formal houses are being built in South Africa for every shack that is newly erected in the country. All of this, we track living standard measures. They determine your standard of living on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is the lowest and 10 is the highest. And we see a substantial shift in that first decade as the proportion of people in the lower end living standard categories leave and move into mid-level and higher end living standard categories. And we begin to say, you know what, South Africa is actually doing a lot better than the critics of the government and the ANC are prepared to concede. And when we look at what lies behind that, we find many of the answers in the economy. The ANC, on coming to power, has inherited a complete catastrophe. The 1980s will be a decade in which 4 of 10 years are spent at growth rates of 0 or negative. And in fact, in 1990, on a per capita basis, a real GDP is 20% lower than it had been in 1980. And this will begin to reverse. As the Asian financial crisis released its grip on South Africa, the rate of economic growth escalates very quickly. By 2004, it's reached 5%. It will remain at that level between 2004 and 7, an average growth rate of 5%, the first time that had happened for 4 consecutive years in South Africa since 1970. Debt levels of government debt are cut in half effectively. Budget deficit inherited from the National Party of the region of -5% and -6 at moments is converted into a budget surplus. And in many respects, South Africa is starting to do pretty well. And in the same moment, I think perhaps driven by the effectiveness of communication strategies driven by the political opposition, a parallel narrative starts to take hold which says, look at ANC voters, they vote on liberation loyalty. They'll never leave the party. They are essentially empty vassals who vote for the ANC in and out and in and out. And we begin to challenge this. And we said we don't think that's the case at all. We're starting to think in the background data to see that, which is of course obvious and logical, that an ANC voter is a pragmatist and that ANC voters vote on the material circumstances that they experience. And the reason the ANC is stronger in 1994 is not because of liberation loyalty, as much as the fact that, in fact, in that first 10 years, the ANC never gets the requisite credit that it is due for what it is doing to the country and the economy. We later understand some of the reasons for that. Ideological opposition to Mbeki and Gear sees the relative left of the party create the narrative of failed service delivery. The political opposition leaps on that, of course, and we point out at various junctures that these narratives, liberation, loyalty, failed service delivery, jobless growth, none of these things line up to what our analysts are reading on the ground. So that's the sort of first part of the political thesis in the book. The book is about far more than the political thesis of the ANC. It's the world and South Africa in the next 20 years, but I'm giving you the highlights from really the political chapter. The next piece of my argument really commences in that fateful window of time between the Polokwane conference of the ANC in December of 2007 and then 18 months later, the depth of the global financial crisis. And a lot has happened in that era. The pragmatic leadership of the party of Mandela and Mbeki has effectively been overthrown. We're moving into the early days of the great escalation of state capture, and policy-wise, many of the ideas being pursued by the new cabinet are very much at odds with the pragmatism of the first decade after 1994. And as South Africa, we sail that ship straight through the global financial crisis. And the consequences are very serious. Economic growth falls flat. And from around 2012, as the world recovers gradually and infused with stimulus, which always worried us, from the financial crisis, South Africa's economic growth curve actually took a different trajectory. The world recovers and we see a sharp decline in our performance. A pattern, incidentally, that we last observed in South African economic data in the aftermath of the political instability triggered by the events of the mid and late 1970s. As that begins to happen, we see the consequences in socio-economic indicators. The number of jobs being created, net new jobs, effectively stagnates. And had it not been for initial hiring in the civil service, the decade after 2008 would have seen very close to zero net new job creation in the country. Be cautious of that data, because informal economy data of that era tends to skew the numbers slightly. Housing, one of the initial great delivery successes of the ANC begins to turn. We see the number of new houses being constructed falling. We see the proportion of families in a formal house begin to stagnate. And in fact, from the latter years of the Zuma era, we see a reversal where the proportion of households in a shack begins to escalate again. Debt levels, government debt levels will more than double, and the deficit that had been a surplus in a decade into democracy will plumb levels last seen at the end of the apartheid era. And we thought, well, here what we've got in the economic and living standards data is the test of whether our thesis on ANC support may be right. Because what is happening to party support as the economy begins to stall and living standards stagnate? And you must be wary of confirmation biases, and you must always be skeptical of analysts such as ourselves. So try to see past, try to establish why they might be wrong. And we have great capacity for doubt ourselves in our own data, but try as we might, doubt much as we can, we couldn't get away from what we found. That second decade sees a significant increase in the levels of what is effectively violent anti-government protest action in the country. Now, some of that data is contested, and there are academic arguments about what triggered protests and the like. But the broad macro trends showed such steep escalations that there really, for us, was very little doubt that we were beginning to see a new political phenomenon in the country, where people were leaving the formal political system but remaining politically engaged and getting on the streets to protest in frustration of the fact that their living standards weren't improving. We could later corroborate that in voter registration data and in voter turnout data. And we also began to see, in line with all these trends, that actual levels of ANC support were beginning to slip. And they'd slip at different rates in different regions and provinces. Natal would for a while hold up, a function of the brilliant campaigning of the Zuma administration in that province. But ultimately, whether these were by-elections or local government elections or national elections, ANC support is beginning to slip. And we think, aha, maybe we have something here. We were right. And they vote on their material circumstances. And in time, a very significant loss of support. But the thesis of liberation voting continues and loyalty voting continues, partly because many analysts are unable to read some of the deeper trends, such as the fact that the number of people who are not voting will grow to exceed the number of people who vote for the ANC. They'll miss that to some extent. Those who see it will misinterpret it as political apathy. People aren't voting because they don't care. Polls we did showed that was completely wrong. People did care. They didn't vote because they didn't like any of the political alternatives that were on the table, and therefore they were resorting to protest, which meant they were still in the active political theatre. They just changed the stage they were campaigning on. So that's the second part of our thesis. Then I take you to last year's election. Polled that election to a significant extent and saw something we thought was very important. The ANC got 57%, which some analysts said showed that it hadn't done too badly, it might have done worse. But I felt that was superficial, that analysis. Because when we broke down the polling data to look deeper than the macro, we began to see that amongst younger people, ANC support in that election was actually flirting with around about the 50% mark. Amongst people who had graduated from high school, the same thing was true. And in urban areas, largely the same thing was also starting to become true. And we thought, this 57% for the ANC, particularly when you take into account low levels of youth registration, is disproportionately built on an aged, more rural, less educated voter demographic. The same bloc that had carried the ANC to such a success electorally over much of the past 20 years. In other words, we began to say, ANC long-term support is on the wrong end of three megatrends. In a country of younger people, only about a third of South Africans are over the age of 35. ANC support is doing really badly. It's on the wrong side of that megatrend. In a country that continues to urbanize, ANC support is on the wrong side of the trend. And in a country of people becoming better educated, despite the school system, ANC support is on the wrong side of that trend as well. And just on the demographic projection alone, taking into account maximum life expectancy, we began to see that the demographic figure alone would be sufficient to make the 2024 election a very close run thing for the ANC, and that the data suggested they were going to lose in 2029. And we built this thesis into the book. We said 2024 or 2029, and that wasn't the first time we'd said that. If you go back through Google, you'll find us saying the similar argument. We've had this argument in mind for some time. Really back to 2012, you'll see we're quite unambiguous in suggesting that 2024 might be the end of South Africa's ruling party. And we got to this point in the book, and the manuscript for the book I submitted to my publisher at Tafelberg at the end of November last year. So roughly a month before the events in Wuhan that have triggered such amazing global circumstances. The COVID pandemic and its effect on South Africa, we felt in the book, did not change the dominant political thesis of ANC defeat in the next decade. In fact, we felt that when we added the likely political vulnerability that South Africa would have to COVID, and we didn't at the time imagine anything as destructive as what has been triggered economically by our lockdown, but when we factored the likely economic consequences of COVID for the world, and therefore South Africa, into our analysis that ANC support was on the wrong end of three megatrends, we changed none of the political, in fact, none of the conclusions in the book at all. We simply said that the COVID pandemic was what we had predicted in the book. We'd written that given South Africa's economic vulnerability and given the ANC's political vulnerability, any great external shock, and we thought it might be Iranians, it could be South Korea, it could be, in North Korea, it could be conflicts in the Stans, it could be any manner of things, the Chinese, US power struggles. Any great global shock was probably sufficient to trigger a real political realignment in South Africa on a scale with what had happened in the country in the 1980s and the 1990s. And COVID is playing that role for us now. It is the inflection point. It is the catalyst that we think is has reached the point where perhaps, I wrote some notes that I'm talking to you from, reached the point perhaps where I'm beginning to think COVID now a sufficient factor for us to say that the ANC has in fact already lost, based on the thesis we developed in the book. Is the economic fallout going to be so severe that the point of no return for the party is now behind them, although very few analysts and observers understand that? I think there's some in the ANC that do understand that, and they know who they are. The question that then emerges is our argument now that ANC defeat is inevitable, and that just as I think the economic effects of the COVID pandemic for South Africa are understated, the political implications are wholly understated, and it will trigger this great realignment. Where will we be wrong? Can the ANC be saved? There are two avenues to that, we think. The one is that the inevitable defeat can be delayed, and that can be done by undermining constitutional safeguards, civil rights protections, and the rule of law. And we do have concern there, some of what we see coming out of the securocrats in the cabinet, many of which have origins in the state capture infrastructure that has been allowed to survive within the government and the ruling party. And I think there is a risk that those elements will use fear of the virus and desperation at the impoverishment that it will bring about to set negative long-term precedents on civil rights and the rule of law that might be relied on later to delay what would inevitably be and still remain would be the thesis of the book, an ANC defeat. So that's a strategy of delay. The only way out of this, we think, and it really is now late in the day, is to survive, the ANC would need to replicate the economic circumstances that it was so successful in creating between 1994 and 2007, when its economic success underpinned this great success in raising the basic living standards of so many desperately poor people. Question is, can the ANC reform? And there is an argument that says that it cannot. And the argument hinges on two insights. The first is that the balance of power within the party is at odds with its reformist elements. The two most influential elements of the current administration and the party administration are the securocrats on the one hand, the legacy of the state capture era, and pretty dogmatic ideologues on the other hand. And between these two factions, they command the balance of power, which is not a new phenomenon. It's in fact the phenomena that was created at the conference in Polokwane now more than a decade ago. The reformers are a minority influence, and because they don't command the balance of power, reform does not happen. And we brief a number of firms and groups about South Africa's future, and we see, therefore, very firsthand the frustration in so many institutions about the absence of structural reform since the Ramaphosa's victory at Nasrec about 3 years ago. And when firms ask us, why is there no reform? Our answer is straightforward. It's that the reformers are not in charge. And I'm afraid more so the events of this past week, the reversal on the cigarette ban, the comments in favor of Dr. Dlamini Zuma, and the absence of firm support for the finance minister, who has taken to social media to lament being ignored. Out for you here. So part of the reason the ANC on the balance of power, and on current trends may never. The second reason why we think the ANC is going to struggle to reform is a structural issue, a management structure, not seen often by, not cited enough by analysts, that the party in exile, without having to account in the form of the internal structures of the ANC, are actually very democratic, as much as they are often corrupted. And I think the comment of Ford is always appropriate. He said that of the cars, who said if I asked people what they wanted, they would have asked for faster horses. And I think the fact that to agree on any firm point of principle, almost 100 people in the ANC collective need to be brought onto one page. You couldn't run a commercial enterprise on that basis. You need a CEO who takes firm decisions with the support of a small board. The structure, the leadership structure of the ANC out of exile means it cannot take those firm decisions. Mandela had the advantage. He set the ANC on the trajectory to economic reform in that famous speech he made in Davos in 1992. But his successors have been hamstrung by the internal nature of the ANC management model, and are therefore now trapped in a ideological prison of their own making, in which we suggest, from which we suggest they will not escape. So our sense, certainly mine, my analyst colleagues are free to have their own senses, but I think the majority opinion is probably with me in the group, that one of the victims of COVID might be South Africa's African National Congress. Not because of the virus in and of itself, but because the virus is exacerbating increasingly well-established trends that we've been able to track over the past 20 years. The last question I'll address, and then I'll give back to Herman, is, well, if you guys say the ANC loses, well, who's going to win? And initially, we think 2024, should the ANC be defeated then, the likelihood is a coalition of sorts. And out of that coalition, one of two new political movements will emerge that will lead South Africa into the 2030s. The first is something to the political left of centre, the long-held desire in much of South Africa's trade union movement and Communist Party, sort of People's Party, Workers' Party, that might harness the assets of the state and the economy to its revolutionary agenda. That's one outcome, and it's a plausible outcome. But around the world, more and more, where centrist, which is what the ANC has been, and left of centre, which is what the ANC has become, movements are defeated. They are not being defeated by other centrists. Examples of Viktor Orban in Hungary, of Bolsonaro in Brazil, is that often these movements are being defeated by populist right-wing political new establishments. The example might be extrapolated to America with the rise of Mr. Trump. Regardless of what one might think of him, he's not in the category of the previous two, but, you know, build a wall is certainly a populist slogan. And you might even take the example as far, although it applies very much less to him, to the success that Mr. Johnson has had in the UK. And against that, we weigh that develops out of our polling the fact that South Africa is a far more conservative society than I think many people understand. And on the basis of that, we've suggested in the book that what comes to lead South Africa into the late 2020s and into the 2030s might be a new right of centre movement that could lead the country with great economic success. Ultimately, however, whoever that is, we speculate a bit there. Of course, that's pretty far ahead of the curve at the moment. But what we are increasingly certain about is that the COVID pandemic is, as much as anything, going to test, and we'll see it in 2024, whether the ANC's long and storied dominance, to a lesser or greater extent, of the political environment in this country is something that's going to start to come to an end. And Herman, I will take questions that there may be. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening for giving us your time this morning, afternoon, and for listening to what we've had to say. Herman, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Cronje. All journalists sitting in on this call and wanting to ask questions, I will now ask one or two questions of Dr. Cronje, just to give everyone time to type up and send me the questions. I repeat, if you want to put a question to Dr. Cronje, please WhatsApp it to me directly. My cell phone number is on the press release that you received, so perhaps you could take the next few moments of me playing for time to just get that information in front of you. I will ask one question and then I will go over to a question that we have received. The question I would like to ask you, Dr. Cronje, is why do people get the current ANC of Cyril Ramaphosa so wrong? What's at the heart of thinking that there is a reformer at the head of the party?
Well, I think there are a few things. Well, one is the trauma of the era of Zuma. And Mr. Ramaphosa is an entirely different kettle of fish, and there's a great relief in that. I think his team is particularly expert in the field of influencing opinion and has done very well in doing that and creating the sense of imminent reform. And I do think if Cyril Ramaphosa had succeeded Mandela, as might or might not have happened, depending on what you believe, he might have done just as well as Mr. Mbeki, if not more so. The circumstances sometimes maketh the man. I think part of the reason for the disappointment and the lack of reform is that in business and in civil society and in the media, a narrative was very quickly built up to say this is the great reformer. And these narratives on South Africa have often been inaccurate, in the same way that the jobless growth narrative was actually just wrong on the facts. The service delivery failure was absolutely wrong on the facts. I think that's some of the reasons why there's this expectation. Why does reform not happen? The answers are often very simple. It's because the reformers don't have command of the balance of power and have been unable to wrestle that command away from their political opponents amongst the securocrats and amongst the ideologues. And bear in mind that Mr. Ramaphosa did win at Nasrec, but the margin of victory, I think, was 179 votes out of more than 4,700 delegates. It's in that range, meaning that if 90 people had voted differently, he would not have become the leader of the ANC. And therefore, the sense, we certainly saw it from corporations, investment banks and the like, that he had been carried to power by a great sweeping victory of reformers who had their origins in the pragmatic ANC of the Mandela and Mbeki years. That was an error of basic analysis. And that pragmatic center of the ANC that Mr. Ramaphosa was thought to lead had, we thought, regrettably been crushed over the previous decade between the Securocrat faction on the one hand, the ideological faction on the other, who collectively, as much as they remain adversaries, had been so central to the defeat of Mr. Mbeki and the reversal of the policies that the ANC had introduced with some success, certainly relative to what was to come in its first decade. Herman.
Excellent. A question I have here, what is the likelihood of the ANC tacking too hard authoritarianism, not giving up power under any circumstances, and thereby perhaps bringing about the end of South African democracy?
Yeah, I think it's a risk that deserves being flighted. It's an outcome that should be considered as much as anything to prevent that it occurs. And you couldn't say that there's an absence of evidence. The manner in which the just always look to the present. It's a good way to. You can have no doubt if you look at the manner in which this lockdown has been enforced, and some of the comments that have been made by the Securocrats and some of the more ideological in the cabinet, that South Africa does not have a cabinet or a political leadership made up exclusively of committed liberal Democrats. There is a strong authoritarian streak. We are now a country under military curfew, in effect. And sometimes one must just stand back a little bit from the present and to see that bigger picture. How has that been able to occur in a country that should stand as a beacon of freedom and liberty in the world? In the book, we go on to quote the very brilliant Zimbabwean, now American-based author Peter Godwin, who observed 2 or 3 years ago that no liberation movement that came to power in Southern Africa through armed struggle surrendered power again. Not SWAPO, not Frelimo, not the MPLA. And the question deserves to be asked of South Africa too. The test of the democracy was always going to be the moment that I think is now approaching, where the command of the liberation movement of the political domain will be tested. In South Africa's case, however, we had to, in the book, make a call. And we toed and froed a bit, but the call we made in the end was based on polling we've done of South Africa's people. And we describe people and their opinions as the most powerful countervailing force in favor of South Africa's long-term success. And while we expect that in the short to medium term, you will see the Securocrats winning some ground, and you will see the ideologues winning some ground, ultimately, whatever confidence they may draw from that will be misplaced, because it will simply accelerate the deterioration in living standards that will remain the defining thing upon which the ANC's grasp of political power in South Africa depends. And even if they sustain themselves somewhat underhandedly, let's say eject the reformers, remove Mr. Ramaphosa, the finance minister resigns, the last of the reformers go, the last of that Mbeki era go. I don't think it will be very long. As long as South Africa preserves the basic trappings of democracy, I think it will be through the ballot box. This is what is the conclusion of the book. Through the ballot box that the political future of the country would be determined, although I expect to be criticized quite effectively in making that argument. I know there are people out there who think that on this argument we might be a bit, not naive, but on this argument we might be more optimistic than circumstances demand. I disagree with that. And I think, yeah, whatever short-term moves you see towards some sort of autocratic behavior will ultimately backfire. Change still occurs 2024, 2029 through the South African ballot box.
I think we have time for perhaps 3 last questions. Where does the EFF factor into all of this?
Well, I think the EFF, we surmise, the EFF needs to get back into the ANC. I don't think they're very brilliant strategists, so terribly hardworking, very disciplined, all the markers of successful people. And I think the strategy from early on was not to leave the ANC, but to understand that the route to lead the ANC would not be through the floors of Luthuli House, but out into the streets to force a balance of power in order to make an offer to a future Secretary General of the party that the party could not refuse. And that moment is definitely being reached now. If you add support the EFF commands to what the ANC presently has, you can get back to the tally that the ANC originally had in 2004. However, I think that given the messiness, the practicalities of, so in theory, the EFF returns the prodigal sons and lead the ANC. A colleague of mine, I think is very right to me. He said, once a politician shows, and should the EFF command the ANC in time, I think it will lead it. Yeah.
Sorry, we did lose you on you said a brilliant colleague of yours. I'm sure you were referring to me, but then we later missed you when you said once a politician, and then we lost you.
Gareth van Onselen, who was my colleague last year, said to me something which is very, very good, that once a politician shows you what they are, you should believe them. It's real. And therefore, should the EFF later command control of the ANC, it will lead it in precisely the direction that the EFF has promised to lead the country in. Of that we have little doubt. However, so in theory, the EFF's return works. In practice, not necessarily, because I don't think there'd be many in the leadership of the ANC who would have any doubt that if you allow those brilliant and hardworking EFF thinkers back into the party, they will eat what remains of the ANC leadership for breakfast and make examples of what are left over in terms of fighting against corruption and various things. So the question is not so much will the EFF wish to return, but will the future leadership of the ANC be open to the return of the EFF, considering that they will have other options at first in the era of coalition. They'll have other options. The smaller parties, you can cobble together 10% of the vote. You can bring in as a coalition partner a far less threatening partner who will accept the mayorship of somewhere in a blue light brigade in exchange for allowing you to run and govern the country. I think there's a good reason why the EFF is not in coalition with the ANC today. And I continue to maintain that it was a serious error of judgment for the DA to get into bed with the EFF, because the EFF strategists of that era, when the getting into bed happened, were much cleverer, much better, much harder working, much better strategists than those in the DA. So the question is, will someone accept the EFF, particularly given the example, the struggles that the DA have had with it? Even if they do, I don't think my thesis changes. I just delay the defeat, because the momentum against the ANC is now so sure in our read that if you bolt yourself to the ANC's plummeting star, do you not inevitably get drawn into that momentum and plummet yourself? And I would think, given how highly I rank the EFF's thinkers, that this very realization is dawning for them too. So it's not an inevitable EFF-ANC coalition, not at all.
Excellent, thank you. And second last question before we have to wrap up. The civil reaction to the lockdown, does that undermine your trust in the common sense of the South African citizen as a countervailing force?
No, it doesn't. They were very scared. They were very afraid of this great unknown, these terrible scenes in Italy. And they had such great confidence in Mr. Ramaphosa, which we know. We say a thing like that because we know. We've read the polls. We can see it. So that explains it. I think the realization is dawning that the confidence was misplaced. And I think very clearly in polling, a polling done by a firm called The Victory that you should look up if they're the best at this, shows that the fear people had of the virus is now being supplanted by their fear of impoverishment. The data is unambiguous. And it's the fear of being impoverished that will drive public opinion on lockdown in South Africa and lockdown protocols over the next 3 to 4 months. And if the government stays on the wrong side of that equation and doesn't lift this lockdown, they will pay a very heavy political price. And I think this is what the Minister of Finance understands and explains his frustration. The securocrats, the ideologues, are unduly confident that they can run a command economy, the backbone of which will be the deployment of the military. I have seen enough polling of South Africa's people over the past many days. I've seen my own experience of roughly 2 decades. I've seen the data of my predecessors. You never go wrong in South Africa if you bet on the pragmatism and if they have the power to make the into the right trajectory.
Sorry, Frans, for very selfish reasons, I'm going to say that we lost you at a very crucial point there, and I think some of my colleagues would want to use that clip very beautifully. You were just about to say, you never go wrong in South Africa. When?
I'm going to say my experience and the data's experience is that in South Africa, you don't go wrong if at the moment of great crisis, you leave a decision in the hands of the average chap on the street. It's the thing that you can create the circumstances for reform. You can create windows for reform. You can prompt reformist leaders. You can undermine non-reformers. All these things can be done. But ultimately, you do get to a point where people need to make a decision. And the decisions that South Africa's people have made over where they've been allowed to make those decisions over much of the past 30 years have generally been very sensible decisions, and it remains the case that the common man, if you were a woman, is revealed in polls to be a pragmatic, centrist, sensible, calm person, and that on the whole, a significant majority of South Africans want exactly the same thing out of the future. As long as that continues to be revealed in polling to us, I will continue to maintain that if South Africa's people make the final decision, the country is in the best hands that it possibly could be.
Excellent. Dr. Cronje, thank you so much for your time. I am going to bring this briefing to a close now. I want to thank everyone for attending this live briefing, for all the questions, and apologies to the questions that could not be asked. We do unfortunately have some time constraints on us. I want to specifically, yes, Frans.
Yeah, if you've got unanswered questions, Herman, because I do need to go on to another event, then my colleagues will answer them on WhatsApp or via email for you this afternoon. And if you haven't posed one yet and wish to, then please send them a WhatsApp or an email and they will answer you.
Excellent. Thank you, Frans. I think the people that I finally want to thank the most are the friends of the IRR. Frans has spoken, I think, quite powerfully about the common sense of ordinary South Africans, and it is only through the common sense of ordinary South Africans that the IRR can continue doing what it is doing. The friends of the IRR give us, through small monthly donations, the ability to really cut to the heart of what can go right and what has gone wrong in this country. We cannot thank you enough, and we want you to please continue supporting us, even if times are hard. We understand that, we experience it, but we can only fight the battle of ideas with your help. Thank you for assisting us so far, and God bless in this difficult time for everyone. Thank you.